I know you've got an ear out for the start of the podcast, but before we jump into today's episode, I wanted to remind you to keep an eye out for Darrell Lee's limited edition Christmas treats, because they're in stores now. Like the iconic Christmas nougat pudding, so yummy and a gorgeous little gift. And some delicious Chrissy-themed twists on your favourite treats, like the Darrell Lee Rockley Road with chewy red and green jelly pieces, green and red crunchy milk chocolate balls, my favourites, and green apple and strawberry flavoured licorice. Watch them disappear. Your Christmas treats table will pop with colour and scrumptiousness. Spread some joy, bring the fun, and enjoy the Christmas tradition that is Darrell Lee. Hurry before they sell out. Darrell Lee makes Christmas better. This is The 5 of My Life with me, Nigel Marsh. The series where I talk to notable people about 5 of their defining things. The way it works is my guests always choose a favourite film, book, song, place and possession. They tell me their choices in advance so I can research them, but they don't tell me why they've chosen them. That's the subject of our conversation. The reason I devised this series is I wanted to create a slightly different way to gain an insight into the real lives and thoughts of prominent people. In this conversation, I was especially keen to talk to Norman about his life beyond his COVID role. It was wonderful to get to know the man behind the fame as he opened up whilst discussing his 5. So Norman, welcome to 5 of My Life.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Nigel.
I'm really looking forward to this. Now, your choices are going to take us on a journey through the 80s, 60s and 40s. But before we get to your choices, I have to confess, mate, that I read at the weekend your book, So You Think You Know What's Good For You. And I have to congratulate you. Just wonderful.
Well, thank you very much. That's very kind of you.
Tell us a little bit about the motivation behind writing that book.
Well, I think it's been in me for a while. I went through a period, well, still do, of giving a lot of talks to people who are younger than me, so usually around about the millennial age group, and they're wanting to know about health. They're a very engaged group of people who know a lot about their health, have lots of questions, and they didn't know what to trust, who to trust, what decisions to be made. There's a lot of health anxiety around, what should I be eating, low carb, high protein, what supplements should I be taking? How much sleep should I be getting? I'm not getting 8 hours a night. That means I'm going to get dementia, doesn't it? There's an epidemic of insomnia because people are worried about insomnia. And it just struck me as a lot of people are worried about a lot of stuff they don't need to be worried about. And also, for years, I've hated the standard health book, which is wags its finger at you, gives you a simple solution to a complicated problem. And as the American humorist H.L. Mencken said, for every, I'm paraphrasing, for every complicated problem, there's a simple solution that's always wrong. And just to show people actually what matters. And with some, it's a bit of a memoir as well. So there's some anecdotes about my life. But I also discovered that really it was obvious that what was interesting millennials interests everybody. So it is a book for all age groups, but it's not a question and answer. It's basically, it's a bit anecdotal in terms of my life and idiosyncratic. It's not a comprehensive book, but because it was originally for millennials, there's a fair bit of sex, drugs and rock and roll in it as well.
It's fabulous. I can't recommend it highly enough. The one thing in it that for me goes to what you've just said, which I've just found very helpful, so thank you, was drink to thirst. That's just, I mean, I've been told, and I'm surrounded by friends who carry around water bottles and feel they have to drink, 4 litres of water, and it's all bollocks.
Yeah, it is all bollocks. They used to do that for, just to give you an example, the Ethiopian marathon runners, the high country runners, run at their fastest 2% dry. And they discovered a real problem with elite athletes and water toxicity by forcing them to drink. So athletes are now taught to drink to thirst. Now, there's a bit of an exception there with older people who might have a bit of dementia, but essentially for the rest of us who are otherwise healthy, don't have any kidney disease, drink to thirst.
I love it. Now, we're going to get into your first choice, which is always the film on 5 of My Life. And you have chosen the film that's been described as the most charming film of the 1980s. It's one of the rare films that gets 100% on Rotten Tomatoes. It's one of my personal favourites. It's Local Hero. Tell us why you've chosen that and your story behind that, Norman.
Well, goes back to my origins in Glasgow, in Scotland, and made by a great Scottish director, a very naturally funny director. I mean, essentially, Glasgow is a very funny city. When you first see it, it looks fairly miserable, but Glaswegians, have some of the best senses of humour that you'll ever come across, and you can be sore laughing, drinking in the pub. And there are very few parts of the world that you actually experience that. And Local Hero just grabs the humour of Scotland and the features and just a sort of gawkiness. It just captures life in Scotland perfectly, at least in that era, and with a lot of idiosyncrasies in the movie.
And for people who don't know, Glasgow is the city of your young childhood?
That's where I was born. Grew up. I left it round about the age of 18. Well, I left it kind of part-time to go to, 19 actually. I went to Glasgow University to do medicine, and then I discovered that was a big mistake staying at home to go to university. So I realised that I'd made a mistake staying at home, and I went to and finished my medical degree at the University of Aberdeen. But yeah, I spent my formative years in Glasgow and great affection for it.
And was it? Can you characterise your childhood as a rough one, or was it middle class? Or
no, my parents, their parents, settled in the Gorbals after migrating from Russia, which was a slum area of Glasgow, which is now largely destroyed. It kind of still exists, but it was slum tenements in those days. But like all new migrants, and the Jews were no different, they worked hard and progressed and moved out into the suburbs, and we lived in the suburbs. We weren't rich, and for a period of my life, my father was out of work, and we lived in genteel poverty. My father was a terrible businessman, as was his father. Actually, to give you an example of this, I'll just tell you this. So my birth name was Swirsky.
Right.
And so two anecdotes about that. So I grew up to the age of 10 with the name Swirsky. My father and his father were in business together, and they were in business together in a garage and it was a garage in the Gorbals, which sold used cars and also repaired cars. And it was largely serving the Jewish community of Glasgow. And to show you my grandfather's marketing nous, his name was Sam Swirsky. And
oh, no.
Yeah, you got it. So in the late 1940s, early 50s, he named his business SS Motors. So not surprisingly, some years later, they went bankrupt. And father was out of work. And then he couldn't find work. And he was looking, he was applying for work. He was a musician as well, and he had his own band, but that never paid very much for the bills. And he couldn't get work. And he changed his name to Swan, and he got work the following week.
And do you think that's a foreigner thing, or an anti-Semitism thing, or both? Is it xenophobia?
No, it's anti-Semitism.
Anti-Semitism, right.
Yeah, which was alive and well. So Scotland, Glasgow, despite being a friendly, very funny city, when I went to medical school in Glasgow, very big class, I think there were 200 people in the class, you knew within a week, and I'm not sure how you knew, who were the Jews, who were the Catholics, and who were the Protestants. It's a very religiously divided city. Less so now, but it's still there. And the Protestants hate the Catholics. Catholics hated the Protestants. The Jews actually were okay, but there was a fair bit of anti-Semitism around. The Catholics and the Jews tended to come together, probably because they shared the same weird ritualistic religions.
Okay, so we're moving from the 80s to the 60s for your book, and it was impossible for me to get hold of. I got a copy on Amazon for $930, but it wouldn't arrive in time. So you very kindly lent me your copy, which I have in front of me, 600 pages of very small type, densely worded prose, and it floored me. I mean, it just knocked me on my backside. So tell us about, please, From the Ends of the Earth, The Peoples of Israel, by Howard Morley Sacker.
Yeah, I The assumption is, so I grew up Jewish and still identify very strongly as Jewish. And I grew up in the shadow of the Second World War. And I mean, interestingly, when you grew up in Scotland, you grew up in the shadow of both wars, actually. I mean, I was born in the early 50s, but I can still remember friends of my grandparents who were in the First War. And I can remember when I was a medical student early on, actually looking after people who were in long-term care after the First World War with lung damage, really come towards the end of their lives. And the Second World War was certainly very fresh in people's mind, more so, I think, than in Australia, because Glasgow had its blitz. You could still see bombed out buildings around Glasgow. If you went on a drive to Loch Lomond, you passed by petrol dumps where the Germans had bombed. And the assumption is, I suppose, in people who are not Jewish, is that every Jew supports the state of Israel. And I suppose that's true, but it's not as true as you actually might think. And growing up, my adolescent rebellion was to join a youth movement whose goal was to settle on kibbutz somewhere in Israel. It was a pioneering youth movement where you learned skills that Jews often are not recognized for: farming, building things. There's a very funny, what's his name? The very funny guy who's a rabbi. He's dead now, but a very funny New York comic who talks about Jews being absolutely useless at anything technical. And what you want is a Gentile to come in and actually change your light bulb or the thing, because they can do stuff which Jews can't do anything. And this is kind of the image of the ghetto Jew who was bookish and learned and did medicine or law, but didn't do anything practical. So this was a pioneering youth movement. And the goal was to go and live in Israel and dig up the land and plow the fields and build the Jewish state. And in talking about that in 2021 jars with a lot of people because, since then there's been the Six-Day War, the occupation of the West Bank, the disenfranchisement of Palestinians, all of which I have a lot of sympathy for. And I basically believe in national self-determination for the Palestinian people. However, that has not stopped me being somebody who believes that there should be a homeland for the Jewish people. And what in Israel, and I don't see how two peoples can't live together. But that's kind of current politics. But then it was kind of uncontroversial. Israel had the image that people had in people's minds of Israel in the 50s and 60s was this pioneering country doing stuff, egalitarian, pioneering social experiments like the kibbutz and so on, and bringing people back home. And the impact of discrimination, the Holocaust, disenfranchisement, people forget that now. And the diversity of peoples who made up the Jewish state and the stories that they came with. And these are the stories that built the land. One of the first things I did when I joined the ABC, well, not the first things, but about a year or two after I joined the ABC, I did a series, not a medical series. I did a series called Visions of Israel, which was a history of the Zionist idea. And a lot of this was incredibly romantic in some ways. There were, in the 20s and 30s, there were communists. There were different factions of communism who fought with each other. There were kibbutzim, where they drew a line down the dining hall. And if you believed in one faction, you ate on that side, and then the other faction you ate on that side, and they didn't speak to each other. And whole kibbutzim split up. And you had this sort of fiery, diverse things. And so we are used to living in Australia, which is a hugely diverse country. But until that migration occurred into Australia after the White Australia policy went, Israel was the most diverse country in the world. And that book reflects the personal and other stories of people who came to Israel to make up the Jewish homeland. Unfortunately, the politics of Israel has swung very far to the right since then. And it's still a very diverse country, but it is dominated by views which really leave that diversity behind, and some of which I feel quite ashamed about.
I spent a year on a kibbutz, Far Bloom. Yeah.
Which one?
Far Bloom, up in the Golan Heights near Kiryat Shimona.
A lot of my friends live next door.
Ah, I mean, it was astonishing. But your book, wow, the story that I feel slightly ashamed that I wasn't across, especially given that I lived there for a year, is my vision of Israel as a Gentile who's I'm sort of a citizen of the world, but I'm not overly interested in Zionism and interested as much as any other person type thing. It's not a specialist subject, but it is. My view is of European Jewish people fleeing Hitler and creating a wonderful country. It's less of the Jewish people that come from Africa, for example, that come from the Muslim countries, the Oriental Jewish people. So to read that book, it was amazing for me, the genuinely just the melting pot that isn't poor people fleeing Germany and France. It's people from Central Africa and places. So to create a country from that is amazing.
Yeah, and there have been about probably by now 6 or 7 waves of migration to Israel, and they've all had their own impact. So prior to the Jewish state, it was very much a European migration with a sort of socialist Zionist idea. Then you had the Middle Eastern Jews rather than African Jews, the Middle Eastern Sephardi Jews arriving from Morocco, Ethiopia. Well, Ethiopia was later, but Ethiopia, Morocco, Tunisia, North Africa largely, and arrived. And that created a huge schism in Israel because they tended to move to disadvantaged areas. They tended to feel neglected by the European domination, which ignored them. And that bitterness flows through to politics today, so that you've got, I think, Naftali Bennett, the current Prime Minister of Israel, for 5 minutes. I think he is actually Sephardi origin. But the Sephardim really supported the right-wing groups because the right-wing politicians exploited that sense of anger at the Israeli Labour Party. And then you had a strong wave of migration from Soviet Union, and they were very conservative because they thought any hint of socialism or egalitarianism was communism. And so those migrations have swung Israel to the right in all their diversity.
Have you ever been tempted to make Aliyah? Is that how you pronounce it? Sorry, Aliyah?
Yeah, I was planning to make Aliyah to go and live in Israel. So a lot of my friends did, and I've got a lot of friends who live in Israel. And I did in my late teens, early 20s, but lost that urge.
We're going to move from the 60s to the 40s for your song, and you've chosen the Cole Porter song, Every Time We Say Goodbye. Now, there are so many different versions of that, from Lady Gaga to Ella Fitzgerald to Annie Lennox to Simply Red. Have you got a particular version that you love, or is it just the song itself?
I love Ella Fitzgerald's version of the song, but I just think that Cole Porter was one of the great poets of the 20th century. It sounds amazing to say that, Philip Larkin and Betjeman and so on. But that great loping language, which is American English, and Cole Porter was just a great example of that. And it really, I like that song, but I really chose it as a reflection of what I listened to as a child. So I have, I do a lot, this is not just with COVID, I do a lot of local radio with the ABC and so on, and shows which kind of make reference to popular culture. And I have always been shite at popular culture. It passed me by, And so if you give me a popular culture reference, I get very anxious. I go into a cold sweat, thinking about, I really should know about the Kinks or the Beatles or the I obviously do know a bit about it, but my father was a musician,
Right.
as I said earlier. After he was bankrupt, he actually gave up on finding a job in commerce, and he retrained as a music teacher. And my father's music collection was, so my father's story basically is, grew up in a very poor household in the Gorbals, was bright. He learned musical instruments, woodwind, saxophone, clarinet, played a lot in his youth, but got into medical school at Glasgow University, but couldn't afford the fees as they were then in just at the beginning of the war. And he ran away from home to join a dance band in London. These were the days of the big bands, and he played in big bands during the war. And in fact, at one point, he had a bad leg and wasn't conscriptable into the army, but he did actually play in the entertainment corps for a while, doing tours. He was in North Africa. So his musical tastes were of the 30s, 40s, 50s. So we had a gramophone, and I would get up, his kids get up early in the morning, and I would go in and I'd put on Frank Sinatra, Ella Fitzgerald, Nat King Cole, and that's Sarah Vaughan, and that's the music that I still preferentially listen to. I mean, when I was doing my house jobs, my first, what you call in Australia, your residency, when I was doing my house jobs in London, I was doing a 1 and 2 roster, but I really made sure I got out on my days off, even though I was completely knackered. And I used to go, it used to cost a lot of money. It used to cost £5 to get in, which is a lot of money, as you would remember, Nigel, to go to Ronnie Scott's jazz club in Soho, tiny little jazz club. But you would go and you'd be at a table, which is, a meter from the stage, and there was Sarah Vaughan singing a meter away from you, things like that. That's what I grew up with. And so that song kind of brings all that back to me, as well as the fact that some of these songwriters and composers were writing poetry.
So I have to ask, I've spent lots of wonderful nights in Ronnie Scott's, but I have to ask, are you a romantic? Would you describe yourself as a romantic?
Kind of, yes. I mean, I wish, if I see a 30s movie, I think, oh God, wouldn't it have been nice to live in the 30s? It would be absolute shite to live in the 30s,
You'd be dead by now. Your life expectancy would be 30.
Yeah, and you wouldn't be living in Hollywood and living with stars and watching, and living in a Busby Berkeley world. But yeah, I'm a sucker. I'll go and see a schmaltzy movie and come out and just be overwhelmed by it. And I'll go with one of my most cynical friends, and they'll say, well, that was complete crap, wasn't it? Romantic, slushy crap. And I think, oh, I like that.
That's interesting, because I've read lots of your interviews that you've given, probably over the last, only ones you've given this century, but you describe yourself, and other people have described yourself, usually very friendlily, as a bit pessimistic and a bit dour. And you don't come across as pessimistic and dour in this conversation. You come across as charming and affable. But would you call yourself pessimistic and dour?
Yeah, I do actually. I have dark moments, right. And yeah. So yeah, I know how to turn it on. Is the answer to that. And so, like a lot of people who know how to turn it on, they're also covering up a little bit of darkness inside. And I put that partly down to Glasgow. But in my defence, I do not that I have to defend anything to do with that. But they do say that pessimists are the realists in this world. And when you talk about, earlier on, you asked what keeps you grounded. It's the knowledge, the absolute firm knowledge that if something good is happening to you, it won't last forever. So enjoy it while you can, and don't believe that there's anything special about this situation. So for example, if you take, whilst obviously COVID has increased my profile was reasonably high before that, and I just knew that there was nothing. When people come up to you in the street and they profess to like you, and et cetera, want to be your friend. For a lot of people, it's because I'm in the media and have access to a large audience. I'm not saying it's cynical, but there's kind of an aura around it. And the biggest mistake you can make in the media is to believe that all these people are your friends.
Yeah.
So it's not that I'm paranoid, but I'm very careful who I call a friend. And so it's just that kind of disbelief and knowledge. And it's not that I'm distrustful of people, new people that I meet, but people who meet me know that they, so whilst I'm talking openly to you and giving of myself, when somebody meets me normally and they're a stranger, they often don't get that much out of me.
Right.
It takes a while for me to warm up.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting that there's a huge difference between attention and friendship, and that doesn't mean those people are cynical or horrible. I remember once I was in a pub in London with one of the members of Led Zeppelin, and I couldn't stop looking at him. And I kept on saying to her, don't look at him, you're probably embarrassed. But I thought, bloody hell, that's a member of Led Zeppelin. So it's just, fame is a weird, it's a weird mistress. We're going to move from the 40s to Scotland, to the Grey One, to a mountain that caused me enormous problems to pronounce because it's spelt Liathak, so I would call it Liathak. But the T is pronounced as a G. Your place on Five of My Life is Liagach, a mountain in the northwest of Scotland. Would you mind describing it and telling us why you chose it?
Most Scots would just call it literally Liathach.
Right.
It's a CH. You've taken the Gaelic spelling, which is good. Very, very impressed. But most of us who climb would call it Liathach. So this is one of the things. Again, not a very Jewish thing to be doing, but I was a bit of a mountain climber when I was at medical school. I love the mountains. Australians don't often like mountains. Australians often feel relaxed with the great open plains. And I get very nervous in the great open plains, but I love mountains. And I'm grossly exaggerating here because there's plenty of Australians who love mountains. And when I say mountain climbing, it was very rarely fingernail stuff, although I can tell you a story where I once almost died on a mountain. But the Liathach is without question my favorite mountain in Scotland. And you go on a single track, what becomes a single track road, usually starting in Inverness, and you track down, long drive. And it's at the top of Loch Torridon, which is an inlet on the west coast of Scotland. The west coast of Scotland, climate change is going to change this because the Gulf Stream is being interrupted, but the Gulf Stream comes across the Gulf of Mexico, and the west coast of Scotland is both a bit wet, but it's also warm-ish compared to the rest of Scotland, certainly the east coast of Scotland. And anyway, you're driving along the single-track road through moorland, so fairly flat moorland with mountains in the distance, and you come around a corner, and there is this. And actually, as a chill goes down my back as I describe it, you come round a corner and this massive buttress suddenly rises from the moorland. And it is just the most scary but majestic mountain from that angle that you'll ever see. And it's a bit of a tricky walk. I mean, most of the time when I say climbing, you're scrambling and climbing up. It's a bit tricky at times. And it's a full day walk, but it's a great mountain. Once you're at the top, you get this amazing view of the west coast.
Yeah, you can see the Isle of Skye and everything. I've been watching lots of films of it in preparation for this, and it's a ridge walk along. I've never heard of the word Munro before, but Munro is the Scottish word for a mountain in Scotland that's above 3,000 feet.
3,000 feet and over, that's right.
But you mentioned that the story, you once almost died on a mountain, and I'm gonna ask you to tell that story because I've got a quote from you, I forget which interview it's from, where you say, "I've got a very strong fear of death," and you've just told me you almost died on a mountain, so it would be bad interviewing if I didn't say, tell me that story.
So there were two, by and large, there were two people I used to climb with who were in my medical school class. And I was leaving Scotland or leaving Britain to come to Australia, this 78. And we decided to have a climbing trip, a few-day climbing trip on Skye, the island of Skye, before I left. It was kind of a farewell trip. And so we planned out our hikes. And usually when you are climbing mountains, so yes, Munros are over 3,000. You never used to climb anything under 3,000 feet. So it had to be a Munro, because there was this whole thing about Munro bagging. Some people call it, there's a very funny psychiatrist who wrote a piece in the Scotsman newspaper once about chronic Munrosis, which is this neurotic desire, obsession to climb every Munro in Scotland, which many people do have. Anyway, we'd chosen various mountains to climb. And there's a very spectacular mountain on the island of Skye. It's part of the Cuillins, which is a ridge of mountains in Skye, and it's called Sgurr-na-Gillian. And there are two ways to do Sgurr-na-Gillian. One is when you're climbing a mountain, you follow a climbing guide, and I think it was called the Highland Mountain Guide or something like that. There was basically a Bible of mountains which gave you a description of how you do it and so on. Very interestingly written, because they had language that you had to interpret carefully before you went out. So there was a route up Sgurr-na-Gillian, which people used to call the tourist route, which is a fairly straightforward path. It wasn't that easy, but it was fairly straightforward to get up to the top. And then there was, in inverted commas, the interesting route. Now, if any mountain guide in Scotland says interesting, then you should wear nappies and bicycle clips and brown trousers, because you are going to shit yourself on them often. And there's sometimes mountains that you probably should use a rope on, but because that's not done, you scramble up. So the interesting route on Sgurr-na-Gillian is via a pinnacle ridge, which from memory is 3 or 4 pinnacles. I think it's 3. And so we left and we decided that we were going to do the pinnacle ridge. And the thing about the pinnacle ridge is when you get to the final pinnacle, you've got to abseil off. There's no way down. You've got to abseil off the final pinnacle. Then you get down to a little gap between that and the main peak, and you've got to climb up. There's no other way down. You've got to get up to the peak and then climb down from the peak to get back. And you go back via the tourist route. So none of us had done this mountain before. And we left early, and it wasn't great weather. And it just took us longer than we thought. Each pinnacle was just quite difficult. And we eventually get to the final pinnacle. And it was November, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. That means it's starting to get dark. And the wind was blowing, and it started to rain / sleet. And we had a rucksack with ropes in it. And we end up at the top of this last pinnacle. And it was the size of a table, a reasonable sized table. And there was nowhere on it that you could see that you would tie the rope onto to abseil off. And we just couldn't see it. And we're getting quite panicky because this is actually now getting quite dangerous. And the friend who was carrying the ropes put them down. And while we looked around, and the wind got so high that it blew the rucksack with the ropes off. No. Yeah. And luckily it lodged about 15 feet down, but at 15 feet down, a fairly sheer slope. The third friend, the other person who was with us, actually rock climbed down 15 feet without ropes on to pick up the rucksack and saved our lives. So anyway, we get the rucksack on, we get the rucksack up. And it's really bad weather. We're going to do it. And we found this tiny little smooth, polished piece of rock. And it was the only thing that we could see that you could possibly put the rock on. And the slightest little thing and the rope would jump off it. Anyway, they knew that I was the biggest coward of the 3. And if they left me up there, I'd die because I wouldn't come down. So they said, you got to go first. So they threw the rope down and it snagged on a loop on another piece of rock over there. So in other words, it didn't fall down to the gap in the you had to get down to between the mountain, between the pinnacle and the main peak. And the loop was a long way from the bottom. So I said, well, what am I supposed to do about that? They said, oh, don't worry about it. When you get down to the bottom of the loop, you just give it a bit of a yank and it'll come free. And I looked at them and they looked at me. I knew that they knew that they were bullshitting me, that there was no way they knew what would happen when I got down to the bottom of the loop. But there was no option. I had to go. So I go down and I get to the bottom of the loop. And they said, yeah, just tug it. So I tugged it and nothing happened. Just tug it again, you'll be fine. So I tugged it again, nothing happened. Well, now you're going to have to tug it really hard. So I tugged it really hard, and I was looking up, and it came away, and the rope hit me full in the face, and I lost my specs. And I forgot that I was abseiling, and I took my hand off the rope to grab my specs, and suddenly realized I was actually falling. Put my hand in my mouth and grabbed the rope. Anyway, we got down, got up to the peak, got back. By the time we were coming off the peak, it was dark. And you had to actually get across a river and find a way across the river. Eventually, we get back to the car. We go to a pub in a place called Sligerchen because we knew that we'd actually had a close one. And we decided we'd reread the fucking manual, the guide. And what the guide said, which we'd missed in the thing, was never come off this mountain in the dark, because more people have been lost in the peat bog than on the mountain. So we poured ourselves another whiskey.
But so tell me about your fear of death. Was that what caused it, or did you always have it?
Oh no, when I'm confronted with those things, that fear of death goes. I mean, I wasn't frightened of dying at that moment. I really wasn't frightened of dying when we lost the ropes. It was all happening in a moment of time. And I would give my life for my children. No, the fear of dying is actually fear. It's more of a fear of old age and dying. It's of the blackness and the oblivion. It's an egocentric thing. Egoists are more fearful of dying than people who aren't so egoistic. It's, how would the world manage without my ego in it? And you can't imagine. And you can't imagine the blackness of death. I really do. I can get quite panicky about it. But the few occasions in my life, there have been a couple of occasions in my life where I've come close to death. That has not been part of it at all. A fear of death.
So this is a perfect link to your fifth and final choice on Five of My Life. You've messed with the format a bit. Unlike Cole Porter, who loved his extravagant possessions, I had to push you 3 times to come up with a possession, and you eventually took a creative slant on the format. And
That's
because I've read your book, mate. Your possession on Five of My Life is control. Tell us about that, Norman.
Well, I'll tell you about the possession thing beforehand. I don't know what it is about me, is that there are things in my life that I like, but not as much as the people around me, not as much as my kids. And if I lost them all, I really wouldn't mind. So I've got nice paintings on the wall, not expensive ones, I've got nice paintings on the wall. I like nice things. Some people say I'm obsessive compulsive about nice things. I mean, I've just thrown out a whole set of cutlery and bought some nice, cool cutlery. But again, if that got lost, big deal. So there's nothing much that I like, but one thing that I cherish is having agency over my life, and I get very shirty. The ABC, which is a large bureaucratic organization, I'm renowned in the ABC for railing against the rules and anybody telling me what to do or trying to adjust my career and so on. I really resist that, and it gets me into trouble. And because I don't, if it means I lose my job in the ABC over arguing for something, at the moment they're trying to take away my engineer for my show, which is even though it's 20 minutes a week, it's quite a complicated show to get to air, and they want to take it away, and I'm just being a pain in the arse about it. And I couldn't give a shit about that. And also I couldn't give a shit, they've got these rules. I did an ad almost for charity for the Cancer Institute in New South Wales on bowel cancer screening, which I got paid a pittance for, and I did it really out of a sense of duty. And I didn't even bother telling the ABC, you're supposed to get permission. I couldn't give a shit about that. And they didn't care about it until the Australian phones up saying, what's Norman Swan doing an ad? And then, of course, the ABC goes into conniption. So I tell you those stories simply because I hate somebody else having agency over my life. I want to have the freedom to do it. And I suppose I've been very lucky in my life that while I'm having a moan about the ABC actually has given me that freedom. Just occasionally, the large bureaucracy gets in the way. It's usually once every 2 years, thereabouts, and we get over it and I move on. But I'm so lucky that I've got a job where I'm my own boss and I decide what I want to do. I take criticism, I get feedback, I'm on a journey to improvement, but it's in a collegiate way and I make the decisions about my life, somebody else doesn't. And I feel unwell when that's taken away from me. And so that's probably the most cherished thing in my life, is having that freedom and that latitude. And there's a lot in my book, so you think you know what's good for you, about that. So a lot of health books jump downstream to things that really don't count that much: fat, protein, supplements, whether it's HIIT or moderate exercise and so on. In the end, a lot of these things don't count because a lot of people don't have the agency to even make the decision to have 40 minutes of exercise a day. And so it's how or they're in jobs where they're oppressed by bad management or told how to micromanage and how they've got to achieve things. And that is erosive and causes illness, causes disease, makes you more susceptible to diabetes, heart disease, cancer, and so on. Sounds very soft, but there's actually very hard science behind it. So what I cherish is that sense of control. And if I lost it, it would ruin my life.
Do you know, that's such a... I mean, I love the fifth choice on Five of My Life. That is such a wonderful choice and story behind it. And it was the strongest theme for me that came out of your book, not your choice, but the book that you've written, So You Think You Know What's Good For You. It's appalling, people from on high finger-waving, telling other people how much, I don't know, vitamin D or Pilates they should do. And you go, guys, turn the telescope around. They haven't got control over their life. It's a holistic message. You have been so wonderful to come on here and share your stories honestly and authentically and vulnerably. That there's one final question. It's a trick question, mate, which is, who would you like to hear on Five of My Life next?
Well, what I love about interviews like this is that you, particularly where you're not rushed, is that it allows you to hear the person behind the story. And I do remember one interview, and I can't remember who did it, with Madonna, funnily enough, which just showed that she's actually quite a thoughtful, deep person. So I don't actually have the person, but it is somebody for whom you think this person is just deeply shallow, but in fact they're not. And they give life and things in it a lot of meaning. And there are a lot of those people around. And and also it's people who don't get credit either for what they do and don't want credit for what they do. So I'm giving you an archetype rather than an individual person.
Okay, and within that, I'm going to give Madge a call and see if I can get Madonna as well.
Okay, good.
Dr. Norman Swan, you've been an absolute angel to come on Five of My Life. Thank you so much indeed.
Thank you for inviting me. It's been fun.
The Five of My Life was presented by me, Nigel Marsh. Producer, Alex Mitchell. Sound production and theme music by Darcy Thompson and Matt Nicholish.